Welcome back to the shop, guys. Several years back when I was in the market for my first Corvette, I was looking very close at both the fourth and the fifth generation of this great iconic American sports car. In this video, I'm going to talk about the top 5 reasons that I ultimately decided to go with the C5 Corvette and pass on the C4, and if I have any regrets. And we're going to do that next.
Toys for Life.
Now this is not a which generation of Corvette is best video, nor is it intended to disrespect the C4 Corvette or its owners in any way. All Corvette generations are awesome, and if you're in the market for one, I urge you to educate yourself as much as possible about the differences between the various years, the various generations, and then when you're armed with all the facts, make a decision as to which one meets your needs best. Now that we've got that little disclaimer out of the way, here are the key reasons in increasing order of importance that there's a C5 in my garage. Number 1, exterior looks. In my opinion, if you're going to own a sports car, then you've absolutely got to be excited by the way it looks, or you're not going to be excited to drive it. Now don't get me wrong, I do like the way the C4 Corvettes look, but then the C5 came out, and I immediately knew that I much preferred the looks of the C5. So much so, in fact, that if I had gone with a C4 and I was out and about on the street and I came across a C5, I knew that I'd be secretly admiring it. To zero in a little bit on the part of the C4's aesthetics that I think are a little bit lacking, I think the rear end is a bit too long and it extends too far from the back of the rear tire to the rear of the bumper. And then if you're standing directly behind the C4, from the top of the rear fascia to kind of the lower part of the bumper area of the fascia, I think it's too short. Now again, it's a purely subjective thing and it's all in what you prefer, but to me, if you look at both the C4 and the C5 rear end side by side, it illustrates and it's obvious that the C4 is a 40-plus-year-old design, while the C5 still looks modern, and that's kind of more my style. The second key reason that I passed on the C4 and went with the C5 Corvette is because of the significant differences in their chassis. Back in 1984, when the C4 Corvette came out, its chassis was a pretty decent improvement over the C3 Corvette. But when the C5 Corvette came out, it became pretty clear that the C4's chassis was almost kind of like a wet noodle compared to the C5, which reportedly the C5's chassis is 4 times more rigid than the C4. Now, 4 times stiffer is a pretty big number and it seemed a little large to me, so I did research it extensively and I was able to find a variety of reputable sources that all confirm that the C5's chassis is, in fact, 4 times stiffer, so I believe it. On a side note, and I promise you it's related, I do have first-hand experience with 4th generation Camaros and Firebirds introduced in 1993 and how significantly improved their chassis were versus their older 3rd generation siblings. And it seems reasonable to me that the engineers at GM probably shared all the common knowledge that they gained between platforms. And of course, I'm sure they shared the OEM level computer-aided design software, which became more and more important in the 80s and 90s, and most certainly contributed to the phenomenal C5 Corvette chassis. Now, in the real world, if your primary reason for purchasing a Corvette is for cruising and car shows, then admittedly, the rigidity of the chassis is probably not one of your primary considerations. But for me, I was aware of the C5's superior chassis, and my long-range plan absolutely called for major increases in torque and horsepower, so the C5's chassis was something that was very high up on my priority list. Oh, and one more chassis-related thing before we move on. As the years go by and the suspension cycles increase, depending on the quality of roads in your area, it is pretty common knowledge that chassis and car bodies loosen up as time go by. So if you were to go with a C5 versus a C4, you'll most likely be listening to a lot less squeaks and rattles in the C5. The third reason that I passed on the C4 Corvette is simply a function of how old they are. I worked at automotive restoration shops throughout high school and college, and I observed several common problems that seem to affect just about all automobiles after a few short decades. So what follows is my short list of potential age-related issues that could surface in no particular order. Fabrics and interiors like to dry out and fade from the sun, and they kind of start to smell funky and disintegrate. Weather stripping also dries out and it decides that it no longer likes to seal out moisture. Fuel tanks that at some point in time during the car's history sat with fuel in it for multiple years while the car was in storage, which gums up everything from the fuel pump to the fuel injectors, and it can be very expensive to fix this issue. Electric switches, gauges, modules, wiring harnesses, pretty much anything electrical tends to have more issues as time goes by. Plastic interior and dash parts have had plenty of time to dry out, so when you do any sort of repair or maintenance to the dash, even a delicate hand can lead to a whole bunch of cracks in your plastic parts. And of course, everybody's favorite, the older a car is, the more likely it is that at some point in time, a family of mice has moved in, raised all kinds of babies, and left the nests and the excrement for you to smell and find.
Chewing up wires and everything in their cars. So, but these Corvettes, any car, can always have a rat nest, squirrel nest, something living in them.
So in my mind, when I bought my Corvette, the C5 was kind of in the sweet spot of the aging cycle. The C4s were cheaper, but in my estimation, they were more likely to have some of these issues that I just listed off surface and become a problem for me. The C6s were obviously much less likely to have any age-related issues, but they cost quite a bit more. And to me, the C5 was right in that middle ground with what I thought was the best risk-reward cost ratio. And now that I've painted that very dark picture about older cars, let me tell you what I've learned about Corvettes in the last 8 years. Very few cars are like Corvettes. People buy Corvettes and they store them, they wash them, they wax them. They absolutely don't drive them in the winter, not in the rain, not in the salt.
Looks like a perfect day to take the Corvette for a ride.
And they don't take them to work in the Southwest United States and let them sit in a parking lot and cook. They keep them at home while they drive their Toyota Camry and let that cook instead.
All right, let's see what we got here. Ooh, yeah, that's looking good.
Even people around here in Minnesota won't think twice about driving their Mustang or their Camaro year-round, leaving it sit in the parking lot in the rain, and they get trashed like any other car. But their Corvette, now that's a different story. It's inside, safe and sound, clean underneath, unlike any other Minnesota cars. And that's why, if you do your homework and you look carefully, you can almost always find a pristine condition C4 or C5 worthy of your purchase. The fourth reason I went with the C5 is because, and this is a big one, the LS engine is more powerful, lighter, more reliable, and more easily upgradable than the LT1 engine that came in the 92 to 96 C4 Corvettes, and here's why. The C5's LS1 is lighter because it uses an aluminum block and aluminum heads, whereas the C4's LT1 uses a cast iron block and aluminum heads. The LS1 produces 350 horsepower and 360 pound-feet of torque, whereas the 96 C4 LT1 only produces 300 horsepower and 335 pound-feet of torque. Both the LS1 and the LT1 are very durable engines, but the LT1 has its own kryptonite. It's known as the OptiSpark ignition system, affectionately known as the OptiJunk, because it hates moisture in it. If it happens to get wet from, say, a leaking water pump, which happens to be right above the OptiSpark, or if you hit a puddle just right, you're probably going to need to call a tow truck. The heart of the LS engine has to be its fantastic cylinder heads, which flow incredibly well as delivered by the General. Now, if that's not enough, the aftermarket has absolutely fallen in love with LS engines, and your selection of camshafts, heads, and other performance components for this engine is almost limitless. Now, by comparison, the LT1 engine, as good as it was, only ran for 5 years in the Corvette from 1992 to 1996. So it's kind of the oddball of small block Chevy engines, and as a result, it's kind of been ignored by the aftermarket. Now the top reason by far that I went with the C5 Corvette versus the C4 is because there is major tuning support for the C5's LS platform versus minimal, at best, tuning support for the engines that were offered in the C4 Corvette. In case you didn't know, just about any time you make a modification to a fuel-injected engine, you really need to retune it to make sure you're getting the most out of it. Now, if you do any sort of a major modification, like a pretty serious camshaft, different cylinder heads, or a supercharger, then tuning is an absolute must, or it's just not going to run right. Now, thankfully for enthusiasts like us, companies like HP Tuners and EFI Live have stepped up and created tuning hardware and tuning software and searchable online active forums to help give us enthusiasts what we need to get started in tuning these vehicles. Now there's also a few companies that have popped up that offer tuning education for a fee. A couple that come to mind are the Tuning School and High Performance Academy, and we also have this thing called YouTube, which has tons of tuning information on it, but it's up to you to figure out what's good advice and maybe not so good advice. That's going to do it for this one, guys, and I'll leave you with this thought. When it comes to buying a Corvette, we all have our own preferences, needs, and budget, so make sure that you do your own research, take your time, be picky, and buy the best Corvette for you. That is, right after you hit the subscribe button and the thumbs up button. Cheers.